My name is Sienna. I am 31 years old, and my wedding day in Sedona, Arizona was supposed to be calm and honest, yet it became the moment I stopped pretending that my own family saw me as someone worth protecting. People stood close. Cameras were lifted. Voices blended into one loud space, and I felt calm, because I believed I had built a life that nothing could break. Not even the people who had always found small ways to make me doubt myself. My sister walked toward me slowly, holding a glass of red wine with a steady hand, and her eyes stayed locked on my face in a way that told me she had been waiting for this exact moment. The wine spilled across the front of my dress in a single smooth movement, soaking into the fabric and reaching my hands while a quiet wave of laughter moved through the crowd like permission to treat me like a joke. She leaned close enough for people nearby to hear her clearly, and she said, "Now it matches your cheap taste without hesitation or shame." I stayed still because I understood the cost of reacting in public, and because I had spent too many years paying for their comfort while pretending it did not matter. My parents tried to call it an accident using soft voices and familiar expressions, but her balance was steady, and her smile did not disappear. I chose silence instead of arguing because giving them a reaction would have given them control. Late that night, when the noise was gone and the house felt empty, I removed my name from the accounts that held their lives together, canceled the automatic payments they depended on, and locked the shared card that disappeared from my wallet every single week. This was not anger, but a clear decision that I had been preparing for longer than I wanted to admit. By the next morning, eviction papers were already moving forward. If you want to understand how a single sentence turned into a decision that changed everything that came after, subscribe to this channel, like this story, and stay until the end, because sometimes the person being laughed at is the only one who truly sees what is coming. 2 hours before the ceremony, I sat alone in the preparation room and tried to hold my focus while listening to the quiet movement of people outside, knowing this was the last calm moment I would experience before everything shifted. My sister Brianna entered the room without asking for permission. She carried a polite smile that looked careful rather than warm. Her eyes moved slowly across me with a kind of calm assessment that felt heavy. The way she stepped closer made it clear that she had not come to help. Mom moved instinctively toward her. Her posture softened immediately. She nodded as Brianna spoke, offering agreement through subtle expressions that carried quiet weight. Even the smallest responses revealed where her loyalty lived. Dad stayed a few steps behind. His shoulders remained still. His hands rested together in front of him. He looked neutral, but his silence felt like a choice. He avoided taking my side, avoided creating balance, avoided any action that would show support. Brianna began speaking in soft comparisons. She mentioned how other weddings often looked. She talked about how certain ceremonies felt more refined. She described how some brides chose details that made everything feel more polished. Her voice stayed calm. Each sentence sounded like advice, yet every word was carefully shaped to weaken my confidence and shift the ground beneath my feet, leaving me to quietly question my own choices without making a scene. My fiancé Lucas walked into the room with controlled steps. He understood the tension before anyone explained it. He looked at me once and chose a path of calm rather than confrontation. He spoke softly, offering distraction instead of challenge, because he knew a public conflict in that small space would only make the situation worse. His presence gave me a sense of steadiness without needing loud reassurance. My best friend Natalie moved closer to me a few moments later. She placed her hand gently over mine. She did not speak much. Her presence stayed quiet, steady, and supportive. She reminded me without words that I was not alone, not invisible, not as fragile as they seemed to believe. That small connection helped me breathe more evenly, even while the pressure inside the room continued to grow in silent ways. Brianna observed everything, adjusting her posture, as if she were measuring the space and the balance of control. Mom stayed close to her, reinforcing that silent alliance through brief looks and subtle movements that needed no explanation. I lowered my gaze for a few seconds. I pressed my lips together. I chose silence because I understood that any reaction would give them exactly what they wanted. I decided to keep my strength for the moments that still waited ahead. When the coordinator announced that it was almost time, the room grew tighter. The air shifted. I stood slowly. I felt something cold settle deep in my chest as I prepared myself to step forward. Minutes before the vows, I stood in the waiting area behind the ceremony space, holding my breath in a way that felt controlled rather than fragile because I had already trained myself not to react too quickly whenever tension began to rise around me. I was adjusting the edge of my dress when Brianna moved closer in a way that felt deliberate instead of accidental. Her steps quiet enough to avoid attention, but direct enough to close the distance between us without hesitation. She leaned in as if she wanted to whisper something personal, but instead, her hand tilted the glass before I could move away. The red liquid spread over the fabric in a slow stain that everyone nearby noticed immediately. She did not apologize. Her eyes stayed on my dress and her mouth curved into a small smile that felt familiar from years of silent competition. "Now it matches your cheap taste." The words were not loud, but they were clear. People close enough to hear froze for a moment, waiting for a reaction that never came. Mom stepped forward almost instantly, placing herself slightly between us, as if she was protecting the situation rather than protecting me. Her voice came out fast and defensive, like she had already prepared herself for this exact moment long before it happened. It was an accident. Her eyes avoided mine, focused instead on the guests nearby, expecting agreement rather than question. There was no sign of hesitation in her tone, only a need to smooth things over before it could become public shame. Dad stood a few steps behind her, close enough to see everything clearly, yet he said nothing. His silence felt heavier than words, because it was not confusion or shock that held him back. It was choice. He looked at the floor for a brief second, then turned his eyes away, as if pretending not to see could somehow make it disappear. In that quiet, I understood that I was alone in ways I had already expected, but never fully accepted. Lucas moved to my side without hesitation. He reached for my hand slowly, not to pull me away, not to make a scene, but to remind me that I was not physically alone in that exact second. His voice was low enough to stay private, steady enough to feel real. "We can handle this later." His fingers tightened slightly around mine, not as a warning, not as a command, but as an anchor that kept me grounded in a moment that could have easily turned into chaos. Inside, I felt the rush of anger, shame, disappointment, and clarity all at once, but I did not allow those emotions to escape through my face or my posture. I understood very clearly that if I reacted the way I wanted to, the ceremony would become a spectacle, and the years of quiet tension in my family would be dragged into public view without any control. I looked at the stain, then lifted my head slowly so that my gaze met the faces around me instead of the damage that had been done. I chose silence not because I was weak, but because I wanted the timing of my response to be mine and not something forced by humiliation. I adjusted my shoulders, straightened my posture, and stepped forward toward the ceremony space with the stain still visible, because I refused to let a calculated act of cruelty decide the tone of the rest of my life. No one stopped me. No one apologized again. No one tried to fix the dress. The music began. I walked forward. That night, I sat alone with my phone in my hands while the house around me finally went quiet, and I opened the county property records website without telling anyone because I felt a strange pull toward documents I had not looked at for years. I typed my full legal name into the search field, expecting nothing more than confirmation of old paperwork, but instead, I saw something that made my breathing steady in a way that felt cold and focused. A small house in Sedona appeared with my name listed as the sole owner, dated from years ago, when my finances were strong enough to protect people who never asked how I managed to make it happen. For a long moment, I stared at the screen. Then I remembered the conversation I had with Mom and Dad when they were struggling to keep up with rent, medical bills, and overdue utilities, and how I offered to buy that property so they would never feel unstable again. I did not buy it as an investment, and I did not think of it as leverage. I bought it so they would have dignity without paperwork that made them feel small. I told them they could live there without pressure and without explanation, and I never imagined that kindness would later be used as a shield for someone who never respected me. After Brianna's divorce, Mom and Dad let her move into that house without telling her the real ownership, and they allowed her to believe it was theirs. They never corrected her arrogance because it kept the peace in their eyes, and it made their lives easier when she settled in without asking questions. Over time, Brianna started treating that house like a symbol of status instead of shelter, speaking down to me whenever we crossed paths, acting as if she was standing on ground she had earned instead of ground that had been quietly built by me. That night, I opened every linked account connected to that property, and I went through each payment method slowly to make sure I understood where my name was attached. I canceled automatic payments for electricity, water, internet services, lawn care fees, maintenance subscriptions, and small recurring charges that I had never bothered to question before. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I made sure every confirmation email arrived in my inbox before moving to the next step. There was no anger in my hands, only precision. I was not trying to hurt anyone in a loud or emotional way. I was simply removing myself from a system that had been built without honesty. After everything was canceled, I opened a new folder on my laptop and started gathering documents, including proof of ownership payment histories, old bank transfers, and original closing paperwork. I did not call anyone in my family. I did not ask questions. I did not offer warnings. I searched quietly for legal guidelines, tenant rights, occupancy rules, and eviction procedures that applied to situations like mine, reading carefully, so every move I planned would be clean, controlled, and impossible to challenge. By the time I closed my laptop, I was no longer confused. I was no longer hurt. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. The next morning arrived without softness, and I moved through it with a clear head, even though my body still carried the tension from everything that had happened. I opened my laptop while the house was quiet and began preparing the notice to vacate, knowing that this was no longer emotional business, but a legal step I had delayed for too many years out of misplaced loyalty. I filed it in my name as the lawful owner using documents I had kept safely stored, and I sent it through the official channels without calling anyone or explaining myself to anyone. Within a few hours, Brianna posted a long message on Facebook that avoided my name, but left no doubt about who she was talking about. She described a sister who changed overnight after marriage and turned her back on family the moment life became comfortable, using language designed to pull sympathy from anyone who read it. The words were carefully chosen to make her look wounded while suggesting I had become cold and selfish, and she shaped the story so that anyone scrolling past would feel urged to take her side without having a single fact. Mom shared the post almost immediately, adding a caption about family loyalty and heartbreak that felt heavier than any direct confrontation could have. She never called me, never asked what had really happened, and never allowed space for my side to exist in her thinking. Watching her amplify that version of the story made something inside me settle, because it showed me that the silence I had felt for years was not misunderstanding, but deliberate avoidance. Dad remained silent in the way he always had, during moments that required courage, choosing comfort over clarity and distance over responsibility. He did not share the post, but he did not contact me either, which felt like another form of agreement built from doing nothing. That silence carried more meaning than words, and I understood that I could not keep expecting fairness from someone who had spent years hiding behind neutrality. Instead of responding publicly, I saved everything, including screenshots of the post, the comments, and the message trail that followed. I archived timestamps along with copies of property records and payment confirmations, organizing them quietly, while avoiding emotional traps that would have pulled me into arguments that led nowhere. Each saved file felt like a small act of self-defense, not built on anger, but built on clarity and preparation. As the morning moved forward, I felt less like a woman being attacked, and more like a woman stepping into her own structure of boundaries, choosing silence where chaos had lived before, and intention where fear used to sit. I did not type a single reply, I did not send a single warning, and I did not give anyone a hint about what was coming next, because sometimes the strongest response is built in silence, rather than noise. A few days later, the house began to feel different even from miles away, because I knew the systems inside it were slowly shutting down without anyone truly understanding why it was happening. The electricity was the first to disappear, not in a dramatic way, but through a silent disconnection that left Brianna sitting in darkness, confused, irritated, and completely unprepared for a reality she had never imagined facing alone. The water followed soon after, not in chaos but in quiet absence, turning daily routines into small, humiliating obstacles that forced her to confront how much she had relied on things she never earned herself. Brianna started searching for a new place to live, believing that she could easily move into another home as she always had, but the reality of financial requirements in the United States was colder than she expected. Property managers asked for proof of stable income, verified employment history, and solid credit reports, none of which she could properly provide without help, and every rejection chipped away at the false confidence she had built over the years. Mom tried to reach out to relatives who had once shown sympathy toward our family, but her voice no longer carried the quiet authority she thought she still had. Phone calls turned short messages went unanswered, and polite excuses replaced real offers of support, making it clear that people were no longer willing to step in simply because she asked. The family network she trusted had weakened while she was busy defending Brianna's choices, and now there was no invisible safety net left beneath her. Dad started to see the truth in ways he could not ignore, not through arguments or accusations, but through silence that grew heavier each day. He began to understand that our family had depended on me far longer than he had ever admitted out loud, and the realization settled into him slowly, like a weight that pressed against his chest without giving him a chance to escape. For the first time, he had no one to blame, no simple explanation to hold on to, and no way to deny what had been built on my support. Brianna tried to reach me not with anger, but with desperation that felt strangely unfamiliar. Her calls came through my phone screen like quiet intrusions, each missed call a reminder of how easily she had dismissed me when she believed she held power, and how quickly that power had vanished. I did not answer, not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew that answering would reopen a door I had already closed with careful intention. Instead of reacting publicly or emotionally, I moved in silence, handling the practical parts of my life that no one else had ever paid attention to. I transferred important personal items out of shared digital accounts, removed sensitive documents from family folders, and secured access to everything that had once been open out of misplaced trust. Every small step felt methodical, calm, and necessary, not driven by anger but guided by clarity I had never allowed myself to feel before. By the end of that week, the cord that tied my stability to their survival had been fully cut, not with drama or noise, but with quiet, deliberate decisions that could not be undone once set in motion. Weeks later, the legal process finally reached its unavoidable conclusion, handled through formal notices, scheduled deadlines, and procedures that left no room for personal feelings or private negotiations. My family was required to leave the house through the proper legal order of the system, supervised by paperwork, rather than confrontation with timelines that could not be argued away or delayed through emotional pleas. From a distance, I understood they were packing under pressure, not because they wanted to accept reality, but because the law gave them no alternative path forward. Brianna moved into a temporary living situation that looked nothing like the lifestyle she had once shown off so comfortably. Her new environment lacked stability, privacy, and any sense of security that she had taken for granted when she believed the house belonged to her world by default. I did not witness it personally, but fragments of information reached me quietly through sources that did not feel the need to exaggerate what was already difficult to accept. Mom started to change in small ways that felt unfamiliar, not louder or more dramatic, but softer in a way that suggested she was beginning to feel the weight of her own decisions. Her attempts to reach me never came directly through confrontation, but through indirect efforts that felt hesitant, careful, and quietly regretful. There were no dramatic apologies waiting for me, only silence mixed with confusion, as though she finally realized that there was no clear bridge back to the distance she had helped create. Dad could no longer hold the role he had protected for so long, because there was no longer a situation he could avoid by standing quietly in the background. Without a stable home, without a clear plan, and without the comfort of pretending everything would fix itself, he slowly lost the authority that had once allowed him to avoid difficult truths. This was not a loud collapse or a visible breakdown, but a quiet erosion of the role he believed he could keep forever without effort. I closed every remaining account that carried shared access, removed linked emails, updated passwords, and rebuilt my digital boundaries in a way that finally reflected my real emotional distance. Every old contact path was blocked, every shared space was sealed, and every form of access they once had was replaced with systems built only for me. This did not feel like revenge, and it did not feel like anger, but it felt like stability shaped by clarity. Helen appeared again, not as a comfort figure, but as a messenger who carried information without emotional decoration or personal judgment. She told me how the house had been emptied, how the locks had been changed, how unfamiliar trucks had arrived to move what remained of my family's belongings. She described the exhaustion in their faces without trying to soften the reality of what had happened, and she spoke with the quiet tone of someone reporting facts rather than feelings. By the time the week settled into routine, I felt something new inside myself, not joy, not bitterness, but a sense of quiet order that I had never experienced before. I understood that I had not destroyed anything because the foundation had already been broken long before I stepped away. I had simply stopped holding it up, and in doing so, I finally gave myself permission to stand on something solid that belonged only to me. Months later, Helen contacted me again with updates that felt less like news and more like echoes from a world I had already left behind. She spoke calmly about Brianna's current situation, explaining how her financial life had collapsed under the weight of unstable work, missed payments, and constant uncertainty. Brianna was no longer surrounded by comfort or routine because she now relied on short-term jobs that offered no security, no benefits, and no real path forward, only enough money to survive through each passing week. Helen also shared how Mom and Dad were living in a form of quiet isolation that grew deeper with time instead of easing. Their social connections weakened because people who once stood close started to distance themselves without any dramatic confrontations. Financial pressure added another layer of silence to their lives because there was no longer an outside source holding everything together. Their world became smaller, quieter, and more limited, shaped by the consequences they had avoided for so many years. During that same period, I finished building a completely new life in Sedona, where the air felt lighter, and every decision I made belonged fully to me. My days no longer revolved around fixing other people's messes or preparing for someone else's emergencies. I chose where to live, how to work, who to trust, and when to rest, without feeling guilty for protecting my peace. There were no secret hopes of reunion, no hidden doors left unlocked, and no unfinished conversations waiting in the background of my mind. I kept my distance with intent rather than anger, because distance was the only way to protect what I had worked so hard to rebuild. I did not hold space for reconciliation, and I did not create opportunities for emotional returns that could reopen wounds that had finally closed. This distance was not cruel, but it was honest, because some relationships cannot be repaired without losing yourself again in the process. Helen became the only bridge of information I allowed to exist because she respected the boundaries I set without attempting to cross them. She told me when events unfolded, but she never asked me to interfere, never pressured me to soften, and never tried to make me feel responsible again. Her role was not to reconnect us, only to keep me informed, so that I would never be surprised by news that no longer had the power to disturb my life. By the time months settled into a new rhythm, I understood that peace is not created by fixing broken people, but by refusing to live inside broken systems. I felt calm in a way that did not depend on anyone else's approval or apology, and that calm became the foundation of everything I continued to build. What I learned through all of this is that boundaries are not acts of cruelty, but acts of survival that protect your dignity when others refuse to respect it. Self-respect means choosing peace over chaos, even when the chaos comes from people who share your blood. Enabling toxic behavior is not kindness, because it only extends the damage and delays the consequences. True strength is quiet, firm, and unwilling to apologize for choosing emotional safety over familiar pain. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end, because stories like this are not about revenge, but about strength, clarity, and choosing yourself when no one else ever did. If this story made you feel something or helped you see situations differently, please share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your perspective, your experiences, or what you would have done in the same situation.